A long, long time ago there was a man. Some say his name was Finn MacCool. They will even tell you that he built the Giant's Causeway. Oh, aye. This was no ordinary man, for you see, Finn was a giant. Not a huge giant, but a giant nonetheless. Finn was a distinguished warrior who hungered for a good fight. He was at least 27 feet tall, judging by the size of his boot down at the causeway. And because of his great stature, he could see far across the sea to Scotland, where one day he saw another giant. "Hey, you!" he called out to the distant massive shape. "You smell like rotten fish. Do you never wash? Man, dear." Benandonner, the Scottish giant, heard the voice from across the sea and turned, out of casual curiosity, to listen to what the wee Irish giant was ranting about. "Your breath smells horrible like cow dung on a hot day, you big idiot, ye," shouted Finn. The giant listened. He could hardly believe his ears. Who was this impetuous fool? Did this wee man not know who he was insulting? The biggest, roughest, toughest, street-fighting giant in all of Scotland. "Hey, Ben, could we not just sit down and discuss this like two rational adults? Hey, is that a hairpiece you're wearing?" Benandonner decided then and there that he would cut off Finn MacCool's head, display it on his spear outside his house, and feed the rest of him to the crows. It seemed only fair. As Finn shouted more insults, Benandonner became more and more angry. A bright light crackled and shone from his bulging eyes. His head, ears, nose and mouth started to produce billowing clouds of steam in the steady downpour of rain that persisted overhead. He opened his huge, gaping, ugly mouth and roared a torrent of unrepeatable Gaelic insults at Finn MacCool. Even the sheep and cattle were embarrassed at Benandonner's lack of social decorum. You know, you can take these Scotsmen absolutely nowhere. "I see you, Jimmy! We know where you live, right? Try this for size, sunshine!" Benandonner reached down with his big sinewy hands, lifted and threw a cluster of huge rocks towards Finn. Some fell with a mighty splash into the sea, and at that moment a great whale shot up into the air with a surprised expression on its face, only to crash back down again into the water. Other rocks shot over Finn's head, landing here and there, making massive divots and hills about the place. This, I believe, is now known as Royal Portrush Golf Course. All this stone throwing, a traditional sport in the north of Ireland, well, it gave Finn MacCool an idea. He had a load of stones that he'd cut and shaped to make a sort of paved area for Una, his wife, and the children back at the house. Now he had a much better use for them. Load after load of these hexagonal-shaped stones he carried in his big, strong arms down to the seashore, from where he began to create a causeway or bridge. It would stretch from the North Antrim coast all the way to Scotland, where his large adversary lodged. Benandonner! Oh, if only Finn had known the true size of Benandonner, he would most likely have built the causeway towards America. When Finn MacCool finally laid his last stone and reached Scotland, he called out to Benandonner, but there was no reply. There was only the sound of the rain and the wind blowing through the heather. So off he set, faster than any seafaring, back across the 18 miles of causeway, to get his tea, put his feet up, thinking no more of the Scottish monster. The next day, Scotland was wet, as usual, and Benandonner awoke. After refreshing himself with that stuff the Scots call porridge, we call it cement here, and a few lightly grilled Highland cattle on toast, washed down with 7 barrels of tea, he set off for his morning stroll, only to notice the newly constructed causeway leading off towards the North Antrim coast and the MacCool family residence. Enraged at the fact that no planning permission had been applied for, Benandonner quickly returned home to pick up his tools of the trade. His shield, mace, hammer, 13 individually named knives, battle helmet, armour, and an enormous 2-handed sword called McSlicer. Benandonner then stomped off to discuss the matter with the young MacCool. The ground shook, the sea tore itself into a raging storm, and Finn's finely jointed causeway rattled under the immense weight of the dark, ominous shape approaching from Scotland. By chance, Finn's wife, Una, was just hanging out the washing when she heard what she thought was distant thunder coming from the direction of Scotland. As she stared out to sea, she began to make out the enormous shape of Benandonner approaching. Through the mists he came, across the sea and storms he came, over the giant's causeway he came to have a battle to the death with Finn MacCool. Finn! Finn! Una gave warning to Finn, who could not believe his eyes. He's a bit of a big lad, thought Finn. This giant was big. I don't just mean big as in big savings, big deal, or big head. No, I mean Italian. Bigissimo. German. Biggerstempen. Scandinavian. Skuldekruisen too. Dutch. Heten reken flaten. Japanese. Hi! American. What a huge dude. Yes, I mean, oh, Mommy, where am I going to hide, big? You see, the distance across the sea had tricked Finn into thinking that Benandonner, that nice wee Scottish stone heaver, was only about his size. He could feel a severe beating coming on, until he spied his youngest child asleep in his cot. Oh! Una, with great haste, reached for her wash basket, and Finn pulled up his coracle, and together they made a do-it-yourself cradle, into which jumped Finn, disguising himself as a big baby. Just in time, too, for Una had only tucked Finn into the cradle, snug as a bug in a rug, when the Scottish giant came striding up the hill towards the MacCool house. He was huge and dark and horrible. Towering menacingly over Una, he boomed out, "I'm here for the head of that wee giant Finn MacCool. Where is he?" Una calmly stepped out from under the giant's shadow into the light of day and answered Benandonner. "Why, Finn's gone out for a wee jog this morning. He normally does 20 laps of Ireland before lunchtime. Would you like to stay and have a bite to eat with us? Finn's partial to a bit of Scottish beef." "Sit yourself down and have a cup of tea. Sure isn't the potato bread just this minute off the griddle?" So the great giant pulled up a chair and sat down to have a cup of tea with Una. conversation was limited to the weather and the finer points of Causeway construction, punctuated only by long silences when all you could hear was the sound of the sea, the delicate plinking of teacups with saucer, the sound of the gulls, and the odd slurping of tea. After a time, Benandonner noticed the large cradle that Una would occasionally take a peek into and gently rock. "What's in that big basket?" he asked, getting up from his seat to take a closer look. "Why, that's our youngest," replied Una with a twinkle in her eye. "Would you like to see him?" "Your what?" said the giant, spitting tea and lumps of potato bread all down his front. "Oh, yes," said Una. "This is Ocean." "He's only 7 months old, and such a fine head of hair already. If you think Ocean's big, you should see his father." The Scottish giant was a bit taken aback. 30 feet, 40 feet, 60 feet. Oh no! In fact, he went into deep shock. A paralyzing fear overtook him as adrenaline pumped through his veins. His hair almost left his head, turning a snowy white on either temple, making him look like an enormous punk badger traffic warden. He lost a lot of weight very, very quickly. But good taste prevents me from describing the scene when Benandonner scaled up in his mind just how big Finn MacCool must be. Needless to say, Benandonner didn't hang about. He politely made his excuses, something about judging a Highland cattle throwing competition at Ayr, and left, legging it for home. Sadly, even at his lighter fighting weight, Benandonner still managed to wreck the already shaken Causeway, leaving only what you see here today. Finn, Una and the children lived for many's a year after. Many tales have been told of this giant among men. We will never really know if these stories are just stories or if a warrior called Finn MacCool really existed. Many folk believe he did exist, perhaps a slightly smaller version. If you look closely as you walk amongst the pillars and the towers of the Giant's Causeway, you may see more if you have a mind to.